But welcome to our study group on disability rights and realities, and I'm delighted today to have Michael Wilcox be our speaker. And he came to us because Jennifer reached out to the Autism Association of New England that has a speakers list, and Michael responded to our call. And I'm not going to tell you a lot about him because I think part of the interest of today will be hearing him tell about himself and his story. But I think, as you know from my email, reading a book was what led him to think, oh, I could be that boy. And then that later led to a realization that maybe he was that boy, and then later he got an actual diagnosis of autism from that. So, Michael, without further introduction, but I'll let everybody introduce themselves and tell them a little bit about what their interests are in this. And as I mentioned, I got interested in this because some students made me aware of a lot of policy issues that we lack here at the Guinea School in relation to students with disabilities. And so we began to gather this group to all learn more about the issues. And let me also introduce Susan Senator. And Susan is a writer, and she wanted to be able to observe Michael in action because she's written a couple of books about autism and is writing another one about adults with autism. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. My son's 24 and definitely very autistic.
And I do need to make a self-correction. I said it was the Autism Association of New England. It's the Asperger's Association of New England that has the speakers bureau. And thanks to Jennifer, we were able to reach out.
True. Although there is some conversation now about changing the name because, as you probably know, Asperger's is no longer an official diagnosis in the DSM. Now that's a topic for another discussion, but and my own opinion is that autism does not belong in the DSM any more than homosexuality does. It's a difference. It's not a disorder. And I sometimes get some objection from people who say, well, but autistic people have a lot of difficulty, and that's certainly true. It's true for Susan's son, it's true for me. I mean, looking back at my life, as you know, I'm fairly new to being autistic in the sense that, I mean, I've always been autistic, but I didn't know it until about 8 years ago. And now that I have that knowledge, I can look back and see a lot of the things in my life that were extremely difficult for me that I didn't understand why they were. And now I do understand. And, you know, in many ways I wish I had the knowledge that I have now back then, but of course I didn't. And I don't really have any regrets about that in the sense that no one did, that no one was aware. I mean, the knowledge of autism has expanded exponentially in recent years. So I think those of you who have children or friends, relatives who are younger, they get an enormous amount of benefit from what's been discovered in the past few years, and probably will continue to benefit from that. Anyway, I don't have any particular agenda because from what Charlie said in his email and what you wrote about in your note that I got from Michelle was I sensed that you would just prefer to have a conversation and well, you don't have to talk because you're excused because you just.
I'll bet he'll talk.
But what I thought I would start out with just an outline of the things that a few things that I'm involved in right now, and maybe some philosophical points about things that are on my mind, and then we can talk about anything. I'm happy to go anywhere that would be helpful to you, whether it has to do with the school or your personal situation or just curiosity. Whatever you want to talk about is fine with me. So I thought I'd start out with telling you about my work on the Autism Commission and a little bit about the state of services in the Commonwealth. And I can say a little bit about what services are like in the rest of the country because we've compared our own to other states. But I don't really know much about other states, so I can't, that's why I'll just talk about what I know about. I joined the Autism Commission about 3 years ago, and it took us almost 2 years to come up with a report. We thought it would be an easy thing because it was, when we started, our charge was to, let me back up a little bit. The commission was created by the legislature. The purpose of the commission was to identify where the gaps in services were in the Commonwealth for autistic people, and make some recommendations about what to do about that. When we did a quick survey, we thought that would be pretty easy to do because many of the people on the commission, there were representatives of many of the state agencies, and there were about 30 so-called public members like me who just came in from the community with various backgrounds. I'm the only only openly autistic member of the commission out of 45 people. That includes the agency representatives and legislative representatives. Most of the other people were, that is the public members who were not state employees, were clinicians or educators. And in one case we had, what's your friend's name, the president of the North Shore College?
Oh, Wayne Burton.
Wayne Burton, right. Wayne Burton, who I think is now retired, is that right? He just retired a year or so ago. He was also you're involved in a group that...
He was the president of, it's the Community College Consortium for Autism and Intellectual Disabilities. And that group is about creating voc ed and independent living skills on community college campuses for people on the spectrum.
Right. So Wayne was extremely helpful in the commission's work because he had the perspective of a college president who had really tried to do something about providing accommodating atmosphere for students at a community college. One of the obvious differences, I'm digressing a little bit, but that's okay because we don't have a program here, right? So, I mean, the original question that I was asked is or statement was that you wanted to learn about ways that you could make the Kennedy School more accommodating and receptive to people with disabilities. Wayne had the experience of doing that for a community college, and he was a great resource and had a lot of not just opinions, but he had success stories about things that had worked. And one of the observations that was made by him and others was that the community college environment was much better, much more suited for the autistic student, because for the most part, the students were living at home, and therefore they were somewhat insulated from the transition to say if you went to UMass in Amherst where there were thousands of people and big dormitories, that would be such a shocking experience that many autistic people would just collapse under the weight of the social world. And so this is a way of transitioning more into the adult world without having to deal with everything at once. It was, and there's a program in Lee that I'm familiar with, Lee, Massachusetts, which is where I'm from, the other end of the state out in the Berkshires. It's called the College Internship Program that has a similar atmosphere. It's not home setting because part of their mission is to take these transition age kids. They're usually high school age up to college age. Many of them have not graduated from high school, and they get their GED while they're there. But they live in an apartment with a couple other roommates, and they learn how to share responsibility for cleaning and cooking. And so they're learning life skills at the same time they're going to Berkshire Community College, or they have a job in the community that will lead to a career. Not just sweeping floors or something, but they're learning to be a chef or whatever they want to do that they can find in the area. So that's a similar kind of model where it's still a little bit sheltered. I mean, it's a sort of one-to-one staff-to-student ratio, so they get a lot of attention, and that's a good way to ease them into the adult setting. So this was one thing that, this one area that we identified as needing some work. And then as we started identifying the other parts of the system, we could see that there were gaps. For example, there's a children's autism waiver. It's a Medicaid waiver that means the federal government pays about half of what the cost to the state is for providing care. And I don't know if you're familiar with the term Medicaid waiver, but when they say waiver, what they're waiving is the cost of institutional care. So when if you as a state have a program, you say we can provide equivalent or better care to a person in a non-institutional setting, then they will waive the requirement, because the Medicaid primarily only pays for institutional care for disabled people. So we will waive the requirement that the person be institutionalized, and we will pay for home services if you can demonstrate that this is better. So we have that for a children's autism waiver. The problem is that the demand there is potentially so enormous, we don't even know what it is, because this program is administered by the Department of Developmental Services. They opened up an application process and they closed it almost immediately. They got so many applications. And right now they're trying to expand it, but I think by the time this expansion is done, there will be about 400 kids in the program. And these are kids who need intense care in the sense that they have therapists come to their home, occupational therapists, speech therapists, whatever they need. And so they have professionals come to their home just about every day, and you can imagine how expensive that is. So that's why it's not a bigger program.
Can I just add something?
Yeah, sure.
You know, and that's also for adults. That waiver, it also encompasses the adult autistic population that qualifies. You know, it's right now it's almost IQ based,
Right.
but that's
Well, that is a separate waiver technically, but yeah, it's called the adult waiver. But,
okay.
But
it's Medicaid.
Yeah, it's still Medicaid. We do have actually DDS. If I throw out abbreviations that you don't know, just raise your hand or yell at me.
The Department
of Developmental Services. Yeah, which is the old DMR, the Department of Mental Retardation. But we don't use that term anymore in this state. There are still plenty of states that have that have the services for people with mental retardation, but we have gotten rid of that terminology. Anyway, so DDS administers a whole bunch of programs that are, some of which are funded by Medicaid, and some of which are funded entirely by the state. Some of which are funded a little bit by private insurance, but not too much of that. Anyway, point I want to make about the Autism Commission is that when we started out, we thought it would be pretty easy to identify what services were being given, and therefore identify what services were missing. And we quickly realized that, except for, as Susan said, there is an adult waiver, but it is primarily for people with intellectual impairment. And so for people like me, there would be nothing, absolutely nothing. And things are changing a little bit. You mentioned the Life Maps program that the Asperger's Association has put together, and that is expanding. And one of the state agencies, the Mass Rehab Commission, has funded. The problem with the program in the beginning, not that it was a problem, it was a very successful program, but because the AANE is a very small nonprofit, they had to charge a fee for it. And not everyone can afford a fee of any kind, so it's just, any fee is too much, so.
Roll it into the IEP. That's what you
Yeah.
have to do.
And so, Charlie Carr, which got me confused because, this is the Carr Center and your name is Charlie. But anyway, Charlie Carr is the commissioner of the Mass Rehab Commission. He found out about this program and heard great things about it and wanted to help fund it so that some of his client base could take advantage of it without paying a fee. So it's been expanded. But it's been a very successful program. And I think part of the reason is that it's individualized, that each coach will work with one person, one-on-one, and find out what it is that they want, what are they trying to accomplish. And it could be getting a job, it could be going to school, it could be just basic living skills, like how do you keep an apartment going, how can I live independently. Whatever their objective is, the coach will, depending on their objective, they might get a different coach, obviously. If they're looking for a job, they'll get someone who's familiar with that process. But it's very, very individualized. So I think that's part of what makes it successful. At any rate, other than a few things like that, what we found is that there were absolutely no services for adults who are autistic. Nothing. And I think that was sort of shocked people. I'm not sure it shocked me because I was so new. I didn't know what to expect, so I just sort of rolled with the punches. But I was sort of surprised that there was this collective sense of disbelief in the room. All these people who have been involved professionally with autism for a long time just hadn't sunk in, I guess, that they had so many anecdotes about struggling for services and their clients who were trying to get services that I guess they didn't see the big picture is that no one had any services. So I know Susan just went yesterday, right, to the hearing on housing.
Bill, yeah.
So we have people who are now, about a year ago, the Autism Commission issued our report. It had a whole bunch of recommendations, but we took a dozen of them and made them high priority. And housing was one of them. I don't know, number 6 or something like that. I don't remember. But and although I think Kathy's bill, as I understand it, is really oriented toward people with disabilities. It's not specifically about autism. Is that right?
I think you're right. I was a little surprised, but yes,
yeah.
it's disabilities in general.
So and so a lot of the programs that, I guess maybe one of the reasons that people were surprised that there are no services for autistic people is that they knew autistic people who were getting services of some kind or another. They might have a Section 8 housing voucher, or they might go to a Tthe program, or they might do other things that seemed like services, which they really are. But they were getting those services because those are either general disability services, not specifically for autism, or because they're poverty programs. So like the Section 8 housing voucher, if you make too much money, you lose your voucher. So these programs were not designed for autistic people, although many autistic people could benefit from them, so they were taking advantage of them. Same thing with SSDI, you know what that is, the Social Security Disability. So there are programs that autistic people can use to get some benefits, but they're very scanty, and most of them are not designed for autistic people. Anyway, just to finish my summary of the Autism Commission, there are two bills that I'm working on because the Asperger's Association decided to, and I'm on the board, I think you know that, decided to make them their priority. They're the number 1 and number 2 priorities of the Autism Commission. Number 1 is to expand eligibility for DDS services. And as Susan mentioned a little while ago, DDS in the past had, especially when it was called DMR, right, had a primary qualification for receiving services from them was an IQ of 70 or below. If you had an IQ above 70, they didn't want to talk to you. No matter what kind of needs you had, no matter what kind of problems you had, that was it. To a hard and fast cutoff. Now, about a year ago, or a little more, there was a court case that was that came challenging that, said that was too rigid. The appeals court agreed, told them they had to change their regulations to be more flexible. So they did. But the IQ test is still there. They just have to consider other things as well. So what we are trying to do here is to move instead to a broader definition of developmental disability. And when I asked around about what we should be doing, there was pretty general agreement that we should be using the federal definition. And that's something that's contained in a piece of legislation called the Federal Developmental Disability Act, which is has a much longer formal title, which I don't remember, but it's generally referred to as the DD Act. And in the DD Act, by the way, if you have a chance to look at it, if you just read the first page or so of it, it's got a beautiful preamble. And one of the things that it says is that disability is a natural part of the human condition. I really like that phrase, that it's, and I'll come back to that in a second, because I think that's something that's important to remember, that disability is natural, that it's not a disorder, it's a difference. And I think that's important to keep in mind. But anyway, what we're trying to do with this is to take that definition and that was in that statute and apply it to the services that are provided here in the state. The definition is essentially a functional one. It says what is a person's functional ability or functional adaptive ability. And what that means, there is a list of 7 life areas, such things as can the person take care of their own finances? Can the person live independently? And a whole list of things like that. And what it says, if a person is significantly impaired in 3 or more of those life areas, then they have a developmental disability. And there are commercial products that are available to measure that. Well, the most well-known one, I think, is called the Vineland scale, but there are many others as well. But the Vineland scale is one product that is used. And
I hate to butt in, but how do you spell it?
Vineland?
Yeah. V-I-N-E-L-A-N-D?
Yep. Yeah. Many states use the federal definition. Some of them specify which commercial tests can or cannot be used, and some of them say nothing about that. So it's just sort of a state-of-the-art thing where I guess it's commonly understood that and other similar tests are good measures. So what happens in a state where this is the definition, a person will take the Vineland test, and I believe it's it's a standardized test like an IQ test or something, but if you fall more than 1 standard deviation below on 3 of those areas, or maybe it's I think there's another definition, which is if you're more than 1 standard. I have it confused as to which is 1 and which is 2, but it's either if you're 2 standard deviations below on 3 of those areas and 1 standard deviation below on the whole thing, then you have a developmental disability, and therefore you would qualify for services under this definition. Well, I thought that was a pretty modest thing to be going for, but we got some pushback on it. Said, well, this is too much, too soon, too fast.
Even though it already exists at the federal level?
Well, yeah, but the federal level, it's not really, it's not a statute that has any teeth, if you will. There's no money attached to it. If you don't do this, they'll still give you money for. There's an organization in this state, and as there is in every state, called the Massachusetts Developmental Disability Council. And their primary function is to take all the federal money that comes in for developmental disabilities and to give it out to the agencies that need it or can use it. So they fund a lot of programs indirectly. I mean, it's a sort of a quasi-state agency that takes care of administering the federal programs or federal monies. So even if you don't have that definition in your state law, you still get the federal money and it still gets spent. So it's really sort of a statute without any teeth, if you will, in that sense. But it is the model for a lot of states. A lot of states use it. We don't. As I said, we did get some pushback. So at the moment, the bill that we're advocating for, which I'm happy to do, is one that has been reduced from developmental disability to autism and Prader-Willi, which is a developmental disability, but it affects very few people. But they have a very vocal advocacy group, so so that excludes things like cerebral palsy, epilepsy, brain injury, things like that. So in my view, and this is my personal view, not as a commissioner, you understand, but that we should have the broad definition. And I have a map for you to, you can just pass that around. You can have one too, Charlie, if you want. Just to show you, I mean, this is sort of unofficial, so don't pass this out for attribution. This is just for your own information. This is based on a study that the Disability Law Center in Boston did for, when I say for me, I guess it was for the bill, but I asked them to do this, and they did. They looked at all 50 states and what their statutes and regulations said. And so the result of this is, you see the gold states are the ones that have DDA is a developmental disability administration. That's the administration that was created by the DD Act. So this is a DD Act compliant state, are the gold states, of which you can see there are quite a large number. The green states are close. It means they don't literally, most of the other states, the gold states have, for the most part, just lifted the definition right out of the federal statute and are using it the way it is there. The green states have either taken that and modified it slightly to exclude maybe some things, but not much, or they have their own definition, which comes very close, in my opinion, to what the DD Act, spirit of the DD Act. The red states, not so good. They have a lot of exclusions, or they have very limited coverage. And there's one state that doesn't provide any services whatsoever. Does this correspond with your image of Massachusetts?
It doesn't correspond with my image of Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas,
Yeah, but
Alabama,
they're
Kentucky,
terrible.
North Carolina.
I know what it says here, but they're terrible. The parents I'm interviewing, not getting
Well-
Or that Mississippi is green.
Yeah. Well, let me say that this is what the DLC did in terms of their research of looking at the statutes and regulations. This is nothing about the quality of the services or how
Right.
available they actually are. And as Susan said, it could be that you have the best law on the books, but if you don't fund the agency and you've got a waiting list, or you turn people away at the flimsiest excuse, then for all practical purposes,
Right, if they're taking Medicaid, then they're probably better. But if they're not taking the
Yeah.
full amount,
Yeah, so this is on paper only, but you can see why I came up with this map, because I'm trying to embarrass the legislators into saying, you think Massachusetts is so great? Not really. So that's one bill that I'm working on. Second bill is has to do with the Department of Mental Health. And in this case, what we're trying to do is to force them to provide services to autistic people, which is something that in the past they have refused to do. And they've had all kinds of excuses, but I think we've finally gotten them to the point of admitting that they should be doing it. Now, getting them to actually do it is a different story, but that's a long involved saga, and if you know people who have tried to get services and have been turned down for that reason, it's extremely frustrating. I know clinicians who have had to get court orders to get services, and this is, in my opinion, totally violates the mission of the agency, which is to provide mental health services to people who need them and can't afford them, that don't have private insurance or can't afford them. They're sort of the agency of last resort, and they are failing autistic people. Anyway, that's sort of my song and dance about the Autism Commission. I think I'm delighted to have been involved. I've met a lot of really wonderful people. I've learned an awful lot. No, I don't have a background in this, and my only expertise in autism is my own experience. And even that, a lot of that is retrospective. I can look back years ago and think, that's why. But I've only been self-aware for the past few years. And my background is in finance. I worked on Wall Street for a long time, and I had a wonderful career. I did quantitative analysis. I loved my job. I was very successful. I traveled the world selling my research. I learned how to be a public speaker, and so I think maybe I'm a pretty good example of an invisible disability, where I had enormous challenges in my profession. For one thing, I can't use the phone very well. I have very poor auditory processing capability. Part of it is I don't think in words. So every time I speak or every time I listen, I have to translate into a concept that I understand. And when I was in college, for example, I couldn't take notes because I can't write and listen at the same time. And I had a friend once who missed a class and came up to me and said, "Could I borrow your notes from the last class?" I said, "Sorry, Mike, I don't take notes." And he looked at me like I must be kidding, because this is a graduate level economics course. And I think he thought I was being mean to him, that I just didn't want to share, but I really never did take notes. And the telephone is the worst, because people speak a lot faster than I can translate. So, and it's hard on the telephone to tell people to slow down and would you say that again, or after a while it becomes just impossible. So anyway, one of the requirements when I was working for Morgan Stanley was that I was supposed to call every client at least every once a month or something like that. There were hundreds of them, and I just couldn't do it. Fortunately, I had an assistant who loved to talk on the phone, and she was so proud of my work that she loved to brag about my work. So, and I think, quite frankly, the clients would rather hear from an attractive young woman than a grouchy old research analyst. So it all worked out very well. But that's an example of the kind of accommodation that I found that I needed throughout my career. I was never able to go to college full time. I tried it, but again, between the social requirements and just the atmosphere of being in such an intense place with no break, it just got to me, and so I dropped out of school and got a job and went nights. So it took me 9 years to get my bachelor's degree, and another 4 to get my master's degree. But that worked for me. That was the way I did it. And I think that's a fairly common story, by the way. So I don't know where that leaves me in terms of giving advice to you guys about how to make this school a better place for autistic people. But I think things that are difficult for me and for I think most autistic people are noisy atmosphere, bright lights, too much activity going on. I used to think that when I went to a party and there was a lot of noise and people and everything, and I'd start to get a headache or break out in a sweat or something. I thought, oh, I must be coming down with something. And so I thought it was me. Well, it was me, but it wasn't that. And now I learned that if I'm in a situation like that, what I need to do is just to go out of the room, go out of the building even, walk around the parking lot or something until I can calm myself down, and then I can go back in. But I didn't know that. I used to just stay there until I collapsed, almost literally. So anyway, I could, as you can tell, talk for about 6 hours about things that interest me about autism and myself, but I really would like to respond to what you're interested in hearing about.
Well, thank you, Michael, and maybe we can ask some of the participants who have sons or daughters or friends with autism to talk about some of their experiences with them or some of the challenges that they've experienced.
Sure.
Well, I have a question about the issue of disclosure.
Yeah.
You decided to share your situation with the world, and I really appreciate the fact that you've done that. I think it takes a lot of courage, and it's one of the things that we're struggling with my son, who I think, has a lot to offer in terms of public service and other things, but stands out in a crowd and people don't really understand him. So could you talk about your decision to disclose and how that has kind of affected you in your career and socially, et cetera?
Sure. How old is your son?
He's 24.
Okay. And what is he involved in now?
Well, he is a senior at UMass Boston, so
Okay.
he's taken 6 years to get his bachelor's degree.
And does he live at home then?
Living at home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not very social guy, but, taking small steps in that direction.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that, the disclosure issue for me was a lot different from someone at that age, because I was 60 years old when I self-discovered that I'm autistic. And in the beginning, I was really torn with whether to be public about it. I mean, I knew that it fit me to a T. I mean, there was no question. After I read that book, and then I did the next thing I did, of course, was go online and read all about Asperger's and autism. And I spent a few months just really thinking, no, that's not really me. And I think the part of that was not really me was the fact that I didn't understand the dry clinical language. And then once I had met a bunch of other people, I'd gone to some AA&E conferences and events and met a bunch of Aspergerians and heard some lectures and stuff, then I began to be more comfortable with, that not only does that describe me, but I feel like I've finally found a place where I belong, which I had never in my life experienced. I always felt like an outsider. I always knew I was different. And it wasn't until I was in a big room full of autistic people that I could relax and be myself. And, there was a point, I remember, I looked around the room that was at an AA&E adult conference in the summer at a local college, and I looked around the room, I thought, boy, these people are weird. And then a little while later I said, boy, these people are weird, just like me. I felt so comfortable. But at that point, I was near the end of my career. So it wasn't and I was working for myself, so I didn't think my boss would mind too much. So the employment part wasn't really an issue. And it wasn't like I had to say anything to clients. I mean, either I did the work they wanted or I didn't, and I was paid based on the merits. So that the employment part wasn't an issue. But the family and friends part was an issue, and associates, people that I worked. I was very active politically at the time, and I had a lot of people who I knew not all that well, but I was doing a lot of stuff with. And I just wondered what they would think of me, and how they would react, and whether it's a good idea to tell them. So I hesitated for a long time, and I think I gradually just started telling people. and it just became, I became comfortable with describing who I am. Partly, I think it's because I didn't really have much to lose at that point in my life. I mean, my family was stuck with me, and when I told them, they said, "Oh, I just thought you were weird," you know. And my friends were friends because they knew I was weird too. I mean, so, you know, I didn't change because I had a label, I think. But my life was pretty established at that point. And I think it's a very different issue for someone who's entering the workforce. And I think the advice that I have seen given most often, which I would have to subscribe to, is that you disclose selectively. In other words, you probably don't, I mean, you might want to, but it depends on the circumstances, obviously. But if you're going to an employer that has advertised that they want disabled people, or they want Aspergerians, then you tell them. But if you go into a normal place of employment that doesn't advertise that way, then I think maybe you want to be cautious about what you say. And then once you have the job, and you find that you might need an accommodation, then you can ask for an accommodation without even disclosing, just saying, bright lights bother me, can I sit in a place that has natural light, or that, you know, that I can control the lighting, that sort of thing. So I'm afraid to say that. We were talking about that a little earlier before you came in, I think, about there's still a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of stigma attached to autism and Asperger's. Not so much as it was even when I first found out about it. I've seen a big change.
Yeah.
When you self-reveal, do you decide to describe yourself as someone with Asperger's, or as autistic, highly functional autistic? How do you, or does that depend on the situation, how you, and what you reveal?
Well, it's partly situational. It's I tend to, since I'm on the board of the Asperger's Association, when I'm with that crowd, I tend to call myself Aspergerian. But for the most part, when I talk to people, I say I'm autistic. That's my preference. If we could just go down that rabbit hole a little bit, the high functioning label. I mean, some people have said, well, what's the difference between high functioning autism and Asperger's? I asked a clinical friend of mine, a psychiatrist, that question a while ago. And he said, well, technically it's the age of language acquisition. So if Asperger's is, there's no noticeable delay in language acquisition. High functioning autism is, a kid is delayed in acquiring language. But he said by the time they're adolescents, you can't tell the difference, so it's really not a very helpful label.
And you're talking about verbal language, spoken language.
Yes. Yeah, spoken language, right.
I have a teenager who's monosyllabic.
That's
I
something
say long
else.
sentences to him, and I get a one-word back.
Well, I'm not sure.
I have one of those.
I think that's called being an adolescent, as I remember. But
I actually asked, I find these lights quite bright. Would you feel more comfortable if they were one of them, if we could dim them a little bit?
Yeah, of course.
Because I would, because I just keep sitting here thinking how bright this light feels.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that would be helpful. But I guess, Charlie, what I've learned is that I try to fit in wherever I go, so I don't tend to complain too much about stuff like that unless it really is giving me a headache. And there are places like that, especially for fluorescent lights will do that. But I'd like to talk about the high functioning label a little bit, because that's one of the misconceptions that's changing about autism. I don't like to use the word spectrum because I think it tends to mean for most people the spectrum of intelligence. And in other words, what's your IQ score? If you have a high IQ, you're high functioning. And if you have a low IQ, you're low functioning. Well, it used to be thought that 70 or 80% of autistic people had a low IQ. In other words, intellectual impairment of some kind. In recent years, that's been reversed. It's now thought, well, it's more like maybe only 20 or 30%. And even more recently, academics have discovered there's actually no relationship between autism and intelligence. It bothers me a little bit to use the word spectrum because I don't think it really means anything. It certainly doesn't say anything about IQ, because IQ isn't related to autism. It may mean how obvious is it that someone is autistic? You know, how quickly can you tell, or can a clinician tell that the person is autistic? Doesn't mean you look at them and say, oh, that person's autistic. You know, you could have to ask questions and have some problem solving or whatever. But someone who is really easy, you say, oh, they're very autistic. But the truth is that I think everyone who's autistic is in many ways the same. That we have sensory issues that neurotypicals don't have, that things bother us that, or don't
What was the
bother
word
us.
you used? You said that they have sensory issues and they use the word that they don't have. I missed that.
Neurotypical.
Okay, I'm sorry.
NTs.
I heard a word I didn't
Yeah.
quite recognize. Neurotypical is the...
Neurotypical. In other words, I help co-lead some couple support groups for AANE, and we call them, at my behest, my invention was, we call them neuro-exceptional couples, meaning that one or both of the partners is not neurotypical. And I think that one of the things that neuroscience is learning is that, you know, it's that these little silos that have been created in the DSM and elsewhere really are not all that helpful, that that autism is not this little island here, and then over here there's schizophrenia, and over here there's bipolar, and then there's dyslexia. You know, these are all somehow mysteriously related, and not that they're the same thing, but they have a lot of commonality. And what they contrast with is neurotypical, which is someone who is not those things. So to me, a neurotypical person has an enormous amount of trouble communicating with a neuroexceptional person because the brains work very, very differently. And I didn't understand this until recently, that I knew, as I said, I've always known I'm different, and I always stood out in school, which annoyed the hell out of me because I never wanted to be the teacher's pet, but I was so bright that I couldn't help it, you know. And I think I acted out a lot sometimes because I wanted to somehow be normal, be one of the kids, you know. Like I figured if I got in trouble with the teacher, maybe that would get me accepted better. But it didn't work. But anyway, the idea of, so a couple of concepts. You want to separate the idea of functionality from intelligence, and either of those from autism. There are three different concepts. Functionality has to do with whether you can tie your shoes, whether you can cross the street safely, whether you can balance a checkbook. That's functionality. It has nothing to do with intelligence, has nothing to do with autism. You can be very bright, I think I am, and not be able to tie your shoes, which I never could learn how to do. I mean, I invented a way to do it because I was afraid I was going to not graduate from kindergarten because that was one of the things we were supposed to learn how to do. But I couldn't do it the way my parents taught me or the teacher taught me. And so I invented my own way, and when the teacher had her back turned, I tied my shoes, and she said, oh, very good, I passed. Here I am. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to go to graduate school. But, so I just want to emphasize that those are unrelated concepts, and I don't think autism is something you can have more or less of. And I think, even when you talk about Nat, you know, I relate so much to some of his experiences, your experiences with him, the rage and the frustration. I've been there. I've done that. You know,
I don't know. Sometimes it really feels like, no, you're wrong. He's
Yeah.
so different from you.
Yeah.
I wish they were not the same thing. you know? I can't get a handle on that.
Well,
Yeah.
exploring that, to those concepts just a little bit, and I invite everybody to participate. One, I think I use the word high functioning to mean how do people move through the world, you know? Can they manage things like a bus and like other things like that? So to me, it doesn't have anything to do with intelligent, it has to do with kind of coping. How do they cope with the activities of daily living?
Well, that's the proper way to use it, I think.
But you mentioned also, you can't have a little bit of autism or a lot of autism, but I sense there are children who are quite withdrawn, and it's very hard to communicate with them, and I think of them as having more severe autism.
Yeah.
But is that not the language that one would use?
I
or
agree
is
with that. You can't get at their intelligence necessarily because of all the things in the world.
Right, we don't know if they're intelligent or not, maybe, because you
Right.
can't access them.
Right. Yeah, I think that is a bit of a mystery, and I think that there has been a lot of progress in some ways in recent years with the new technology, with iPads and other devices that people who formerly were not able to communicate. I mean, your son does some of that, right?
He has started to use Facebook as a way to communicate, finally.
But there are other people I know who, like, you know Amy Sequenzia? A friend of mine who is non-speaking and has seizure disorder. She has a lot of seizures. She has an aide with her at all times, but she is extremely articulate with her iPad, you know, what she has to have. She has, what's the word, assisted?
Assisted technology or facilitated communication.
Facilitated communication. She has to have someone hold her elbow so she can, because she doesn't have the muscle strength to lift her arm to push the keypad. But once she gets a little bit of assistance, she writes poetry. She's very articulate. You know, so there are people like that we don't know, and maybe like Nat. I mean, I know some of your frustration of not really knowing how much he understands, or so there's still a lot to be learned.
And I don't know what you call it then. I mean, how do I describe him? You know, I would say severe, low functioning, but you would not.
Well, he may. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, he can't live independently.
Right.
So that's
Not yet.
Yeah.
I'm always turned off by this term functioning. I think it's so clinical and doesn't really refer to the person, but refers to what we've sort of placed on the person in terms of what they are able and not able to do. So I've always resisted using it, and I gotta say I'm a bit put off by it. I just don't.
Yeah.
When I think about it being applied to my child, I shudder.
Because you think there's a judgment there that a low-functioning person is...
Well, you know, when I think about the language applied to people in institutions, and you know, I'm old enough to remember the change in philosophy from institutionalizing children to having them in the community. So, I'm sorry, Charlie, your question was?
I was curious if the reason that you resisted that term or had a dislike for it was because the term low functioning was a judgment of some kind about a person.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a judgment.
Something occurs to me that I would like to try out on all of you. I had the great privilege, and I didn't realize how big a privilege it was to know a woman named Isabel Myers-Briggs some years ago. And Isabel Myers-Briggs developed this personality test. And she had developed it by watching students who came in her home. Her husband was a physician at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, and in Hershey, and the students would come in their home and she would get to know them, and she figured out by observation after a while that some people would make choices that were very ill-suited to their personalities. So, for instance, she would get to know somebody who couldn't deal with much uncertainty, and if they chose to be a psychiatrist, they would end up very unhappy in their profession and would end up leaving psychiatry. And so she developed this scale based on Jungian characteristics of how we process information. And so, there's 4 pairs of scales, but for instance, one of them is intuitive, and one of them is sensing. So sensing people like to kind of have a measure of things. Is this 5 inches long, or is this? Intuitive people don't really care. They just have a sense of what. They have an instinct about that. But really, she developed that test, and it's very well validated now and used by lots of people. But what she discovered was that we have different ways of processing information, some that we are better at than others. And if we end up making choices that are contrary to those preferences we have, we may end up struggling a lot. Struggling with our profession, struggling in our communication with our spouses or whatever. And it seems like to me that there's certain characteristics of autism that fit that in a way. Now, we don't consider any of those mental disabilities or any problems. They're just characteristics of how we process information. But it seems like that autism is to a certain degree also about how we process information. And yeah, there's a lot of stigma attached to it. But she could really show that if people chose a work situation that was contrary to what their perceived strengths and preferences were for processing information, they can end up being very unhappy and even dysfunctional in that particular kind of thing. So it seems like there's some that maybe we've just taken some of those things that Isabel Myers-Briggs did, and we've gone further with autism in a way. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. If the Briggs test is really about preference, then why not apply that to helping someone like my daughter just sort of outline what her preferences are and be able to focus on what her job choices should be.
And that's exactly what Isabel Myers-Briggs did. She turned this test over to the American Medical Student Association because she said she never wanted this to be used to limit someone, to keep somebody from doing something, but to help them make better choices about. And the interesting thing is, so there's 2 of these polls on here. The one I mentioned was intuitive and sensing, and intuitive people don't care how you do something, they just want to do it. Whereas sensing people always want to know how you're going to do something. So there were 17 N's on this board we were on. This is the board of the American Medical Students. 17 N's on there, intuitive people who were dreamers and idealistic, want to do everything. And there was one sensing person, and he was the treasurer, and that was me. And, I was always and we were often fighting with each other. I would really fight this whole board of people about how are we going to do this, and we can't afford to do this, and where's the. And once we understood each other, we could communicate a lot better because they could understand why I was asking the questions I was asking. But there are many different, as I said, there's 4 different sets of these things, but we could communicate and work a lot better together when we understood what the other person's preferences were in terms of you could almost change your arguments to be more suited to some of them. So
There's a book that I read recently called The Emotional Life of Your Brain, and it's actually by a former Harvard professor, so you would probably approve of it, but...
I'm not a professor, so...
Oh, okay, well, I forgot his name, Davidson, I think.
Is it a good book? Do you enjoy it?
Yeah, it was good, but it was coming at the same thing from a neuroscience point of view, saying, well, instead of just making up, a scale based on observation, why don't we see how the brain reacts to certain situations? And I won't go into it because I don't remember the details, but in that case, I mean, it was not about autism, it was just about neuroscience, but I didn't really see that there would be any particular personality type that would describe autism. You know, you're right, it's a completely different way of processing information. However, given that, I think that autistic people demonstrate the same variety of personalities and preferences that the rest of the world does. With some notable exceptions. There's been some good research done at MIT, if I'm allowed to use that word in the room. There's a bunch of labs over there that are primarily financed by the Simons Foundation, so there are some Harvard people there too I've met. But Nancy Canwisher is an MIT professor who has done very creative work having to do with autism. And one of the myths of autism that I think she has, as far as I'm concerned, she has smashed, is that autistic people have poor central coherence. In other words, the myth is that we can't see the forest for the trees, you know, that we're always looking at the details and therefore we miss the big picture. And yet I have autistic friends who heard that and said, well, but I'm a systemic thinker. I see the big picture, but I also see the details, so how do you explain that? And Nancy did that. She administered the test that has been done so many times. It's called embedded figures. That's one of the, you've seen that, where
Right.
you have a triangle and inside there's a bunch of squares, or you have a big square and inside there's a bunch of little triangles. And you show it to somebody and say, what do you see? And autistic people would always pick the little figures. Not always, but, you know,
Yeah.
statistically speaking, would pick the little figures, and neurotypical people would pick the big picture. And she said, well, we didn't actually give them any instructions. We just said, what do you see? So what if we tell them what we're looking for is for you to spot the big picture? Well, they did just as well, if not better, than the neurotypical people on the test. And it was just a question of, so her conclusion was that the details were not all they saw. It's just that was more interesting to them. So it was a preference, not a different, not a different ability.
It's amazing.
Yeah. And she's done other stuff like that, which has shown, for example, there's a thing called multiple object tracking, which is like a little computer video game where you kind of predict where the mouse is, or whatever it is that's running around the screen, where it's going to go next, and you click. Well, it turns out that's a skill that develops with age. So if you look at groups of kids who are doing this, whether they're neurotypical or autistic, as they age, they get better at it. But if you compare autistic and neurotypical kids at the same age, the neurotypical kids are better at it. So the conclusion is that there's some defect in autism that causes autistic kids not to do as well. But the thing is, if you look at both graphs, and you shift the autistic kids over about 18 months, then they're identical. So this simply suggests that this is an area where there's a developmental delay in autistic kids. But by the time they get to be teenagers, they're equally skilled. So it calls into question a lot of the research that's been done, which has primarily been done in children. And generally the control group is matched for age, IQ, gender, and all that kind of stuff. Well, if you're matching it on age, and we know that it takes the autistic brain a little longer to develop, then is it really a good piece of research? It just calls into question some of the conclusions that people have reached. So again, I think we're coming more to the point, I hope, of seeing autism as a difference and not as a defect, not as a disorder. We're still a long way from there, and that's when you come back to your disclosure question. Even within the autistic community and even within the academic community, there's still a lot of disagreement about what all of this stuff means. And so we're a long way from coming into the popular perception of, I think that's one of the reasons that people are resisting dropping the label Asperger's, is that that's got a little cachet now with all the TV shows and so on that have depicted Asperger's people.
Or your boss, Larry Summers.
Well, true.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, just getting back to this question of the school and how this school could be more open and accessible to people with disabilities, I'm sure that there are many students who are autistic and faculty members as well.
Mhm.
But it's not something that we talk about as far as I know. I've been here for 10 years and I'm listening because of my personal situation and I'm not hearing much discussion. And I do think this is a pretty overstimulating place with the lights on bright, most classrooms are, what could we do to make this a more, a place where people felt safer to talk about these issues and perhaps, take a little longer to get their degree if that's what made the difference or, so any thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, well, I'm more inclined to think, since it's been so long since I've been in school, but I'm more predisposed to think about workplace accommodations.
Yeah.
Because I'm looking back again on my career, I can see how I did a lot of things that made my life easier, such as coming in late so that I could avoid all the hubbub around the rush hour and then working late to make up for it, but shifting my schedule. I told you about the telephone thing.
And is that a very typical Asperger's or characteristic or autism that a telephone is a challenging?
Not for everybody. I have autistic friends who love talking on the phone, so it depends. I think there are different types of thinkers, and I'm a conceptual thinker. There are other people who describe themselves as thinking in pictures. I don't know if you know Temple Grandin, but her example that she gives of designing her cattle chutes and being able to rotate them in her head and see what they look like from the point of view of the cow and that kind of thing. And when somebody challenged her, said, "How do you know it's going to work?" She said, "Well, because I tested it out." How could you test it in my head? And that I don't have that ability. Although, as a little sidebar, that I have a friend who teaches architecture at Oxford University, and I was having drinks with him about a year ago, and he was saying, "Well, I think about 30% of my students are dyslexic." I said, "Why is that, Toby?" He said, "Well, I think it's because they have the ability to visualize 3D structures in their head and rotate them and design them and redesign them, and so before they even get to the computer or a piece of paper, they've done half the work." And I said, "Well, that's interesting. You ever heard of Temple Grandin?" He said, "No." So again, that's why I hear things like this all the time. It makes me realize that dyslexia and autism have a lot in common. That may be one of the things for some people, not for everybody. Social issues, but so that's one of the problems, is that there is probably nothing universal. I think you have to hear from the person, but how you get people to come forward is another issue, and but maybe making it clear that schedules can be made more flexible, that can do a certain amount of independent work as opposed to having to do it in a classroom or in a group setting. I don't know what else to suggest. What have you thought about that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think one of the motivations for the study group, Charlie, was that you felt like, where are the people with disabilities in our world here? And if they're here, we don't know about them.
And, I mentioned that I'm not sure if I said it in here, but I've taught at a few other places. I'm not a professional teacher, but I taught at University of San Francisco, a Jesuit institution, and there I got a letter, first day class, saying this student has a learning disability and is going to need longer on tests and longer on written assignments, and if you can allow her to do visual assignments like with a video camera, that's preferred. And I sat down and talked to her, and then we worked out the different ways, but I've never gotten that kind of letter here in 4 years.
I think one of the problems at Harvard is that there's no central office for disability, and there really needs to be. It can't be every tub on its own bottom.
Yeah.
Harvard, with its resources, could certainly have an incredible disability office and disperse that information and those services, but it doesn't.
And give
It's like
talks and
when you
trainings.
Think about it that way. It would be hard to get anybody's head around the idea of having a central office for this one.
And then, Tim, you know, there is
Wow.
last week, the speaker, not last week, but 2 weeks ago, someone who's going to come, not the speaker, but a woman was going to attend this session who was blind and deaf.
Mhm.
And she sent me an email saying she wanted to attend, and I wrote back to her and said, you know, how can we accommodate you? And she said, well, I will need a CAMP, which is a computer-assisted device that, kind of like you described, that she can type on, and someone helps her to type on it.
Mhm.
And so I called the Office of Disabilities of Harvard University and said, I have this student, not a student, but someone coming to an informal class, and I need some assistance. And they have CAMP devices, but you have to pay a minimum of $150 an hour and 2 hours. So either the person coming would have to bear that, or we could have borne that. And actually, we could bear that. We have a little bit of resources for this session because of a donor. I mean, for this study group. But it's really interesting that Harvard doesn't provide any of those things. And they said the other thing is you can hire someone who could be a tactile signer, I think, who could sign by touching her arm, and those are $100 an hour, and they said we'll put out a call for those. And so the burden was all on either me or the person with the disability, and that seemed kind of strange.
It's totally off. I mean, it has nothing to do with inclusion.
No.
Or really the mission of the university. So it's really wrong.
Have you tried to bring this to someone's attention?
No, I've only started to learn about it by talking about to some of the people who are in the study group about what it's like to be at the school with a disability. And I've certainly, being in the library, watching students who, having a child, someone with dyslexia and a child with, you know, some autism issues, you know, you can kind of spot kids who may be struggling. And I watched one kid come through, and I just saw his depression go down. I mean, he got more and more depressed. He spent an extra semester and a half here. You know, I knew I had actually seen some of his work because he needed help with something he was doing on the computer. I took a look at it, and I thought, wow, this guy's really got some issues. And, you know, I don't know how he was being supported through the school, and it wasn't okay for me to just to say, you know, what kind of assistance do you need at that point? So.
Well, I wanted to tell some good news that David doesn't know, but there's somebody doing some research for us, a volunteer, who has had severe issues with depression. And he was applying to this school and other policy schools. And so David and I encouraged him to actually talk about that in his application, because he had some bad grades as an undergraduate because he went into severe depression.
Mhm.
And he put that in his application, that his bad grades in 2 semesters were related to severe depression, where he actually had to drop out of school. It was so great. And he just got into George Washington.
Oh, fabulous, that's great.
So
That's terrific.
I have wrestled with depression myself, so I was encouraging him to actually talk about it and not hide it. And he did, and did it very gracefully.
And I've read so many thousands of essays. I'm glad that when somebody says something that's interesting, like I have depression, it's a relief, because this is it's from my point of view, it's actually a marketing advantage if you're reading somebody's file. So it wasn't just to protect them. It's like this is something that makes your application actually stand out. I've struggled with this.
No.
Yeah. So I'm glad that
I
you did
didn't
that.
know that. I just learned
That's great.
2 days
That's
ago that
terrific.
they got admitted. But
That's a topic I'm interested in too, and, you know, depression and autism go together like hand in glove. I don't really know anyone who's autistic who hasn't had challenges around depression. And I wrote a little essay about it because the AANE and somebody else, I forgot who was, you know, you're familiar with, did I tell you about next month, there's a conference on depression.
Yep.
It's mostly for clinicians, but what they did is they asked a few Aspergerian autistic people if they would share their own experience, just in a 2-minute talk. So I wrote a little essay and submitted it, and they rejected that, which of course made me very depressed. But, anyway, but what I, and that was one of the links I sent you, I don't know if you shared those, but it was the healing power of depression and how I've learned to live with it and actually make it into a more positive experience. And I think, you see the statistics that something like half of all people in the world are going to experience depression at one point in their life. And to me, that means it's not really a disorder. There's something, if half the people in the world experience it, it can't really be evil, totally, being a rather ardent Darwinian myself. I figure, well, if it's really that bad, it would have disappeared, but like autism. And I recently read an article, recent to me, I think it's a little old, but there was a Scientific American, very short article about describing depression as a cognitive process. That this is the way we deal with social challenges, and that we have to stop and think about it and work it out, and eventually we do. And that's the function of depression, according to this author. I haven't really researched it that much, but that has a lot of appeal to me. And it also explains to me a lot of why there would be a link between autism and depression, because I think the autistic brain is extremely cognitive. So I think, it's just an example of how much we don't know. It's just, I think if I had it to do over again, I'd probably go back into neuroscience and not into economics, but that's really the result of my interest in myself and trying to understand myself.
Charlie's email did have your website on it, so these would be off of this, off the book.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
All right.
Good. Well, I'd really, let me leave you with my card too, and I realize there's probably 1,000 things that we could have talked about that we didn't, and I'd be happy to answer your questions by email. Don't try to phone me, but just. But
I did put your phone number, no,
that's okay. Well, I just want to answer the phone. That's all. It's no big deal.
Well, Michael drove over here from Western Massachusetts to be with us today, so I just want to thank him for. Turned out to be a challenging day. We usually have more people than this, but it's been a very personal experience, and we're really glad you could come and help us to understand some of these issues in a very personal way.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. One other thought that occurs to me that that you could do to help the school is just have some public meetings, informational meetings, and have somebody like me or someone who knows the issues come in and do this to a broader audience. And maybe no one would show up, or maybe they would, but I think the more you can talk about it in the open, the easier it gets for people to do the disclosure and to, that's certainly what happened to me, is that, as I said earlier, I was very hesitant to be public until I'd met a bunch of people and realized, hey, this isn't the end of the world. This is like, there's a lot of people like me. I'm weird, but I've got a lot of company. No, it's not. And that's important to realize, that it's, the official statistics are that we're something like 2% of the world, but if you add in all those other related things that I mentioned, well, maybe we're more like 10 or 15% of the world.
Well, in medical terms, 2% is an epidemic. If 2% of people have a disease, it's a severe epidemic. That's the way epidemiologists think. So 10 or 15% is, I don't know what you'd call that.
You can pass those around, and so people can have my email address if they want to, or maybe they already do. But anyway, it's.
Michael, one thing I will.
You can keep those maps if you want to. Just don't attribute them to me.
One thing I think, carry away from this is your description of being with a room full of other autistic people and thinking, these people are weird, and then 15 minutes later thinking, these people are weird like me.
Yeah, I think I'm so glad that I learned, that I figured it out, that, and it came a little strangely through reading that book, but that's okay.
What was the book?
The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime.
Right, that was interesting.
And,
right.
Yeah, and I don't think it mentioned the word autism in there at all. except on the jacket it said
Yeah.
that the author had taught autistic kids, and I thought,
And
what?
he was a camp counselor, and just like, but he got it so
Yeah.
spot on.
Well, it was so accurate that, you know, you have to think it might have been autobiographical to some
Mhm, yeah.
extent, but,
Yeah.
Well, he is an odd guy. Well, if you look at his website,
okay.
yeah.
Well, I've never met him, but I did see, you know, when they did that broadcast, he was interviewed, and he,
Michael, I didn't ask you, but we tape these sessions for the students who can't be here.
Yes.
And put them on our website so that the 6 or 8 students who couldn't be here today can pick up on this. Do you mind if we put this on our website?
no, you have my permission, that's fine.
Okay, terrific, thank you. Great. Well, thanks, everyone.
Thank
And,
you.
Thank you.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.